When 14-year-old Andrea Bowman disappeared in 1989, everyone asked the same questions. Where did she go? Who did she leave with? Why did she run away? But there was one question nobody thought to ask. What if she's still here? Not across state lines. Not living under a new identity. Not hiding from her strict religious parents. Here. Right here. 6 feet under the backyard of the family home. It would take 30 years before someone finally asked that question. And when they did, when excavators tore up the earth behind a house on 134th Avenue in Michigan, they found exactly what nobody wanted to find. A trash bag, used diapers placed inside to mask the scent. And beneath it all, the remains of a girl who never ran anywhere. She'd been there the whole time. While search parties combed the county. While her face appeared on MTV. While her birth mother drove dark country roads looking for her. While her father walked past her grave more than 100 times. This is the story of the question nobody asked until it was 3 decades too late. Welcome to Buried Secret Media. I'm about to take you through one of the most disturbing cases of deception and buried truth you've ever heard. This is a story about a system that failed at every level. About a predator who hid in plain sight for decades. About a mother who never stopped believing. And about a girl who deserved so much better than the hand life dealt her. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, stick around because we dive deep into cases that need to be told. To understand what happened to Andrea, we have to go back to 1972, to Virginia, to a teenage girl named Kathy Turkanian who was just a child herself, barely old enough to understand the weight of the choices she was being forced to make. Kathy's childhood was marked by neglect and emotional abandonment. Her parents saw her not as a daughter to be loved and nurtured, but as a burden to be managed. Every day in that house reminded her that she was unwanted. The looks, the silences, the way they spoke about her, as if she weren't in the room. At 15 years old, Kathy made a desperate decision. With no money in her pocket, no plan beyond escape, she stuck out her thumb on the side of a Virginia highway and hitchhiked all the way to Memphis, Tennessee. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But staying felt more dangerous still. In Memphis, she met Randy Badger, a 19-year-old who seemed to offer everything her parents hadn't. Attention, affection, the promise of a fresh start. To a girl who'd never known unconditional love, Randy's interest felt like salvation. By December of that year, they were married. Not in Virginia, where the law would have required Kathy to wait until she was older, but in South Carolina, one of the few states that would allow a minor to marry with parental permission. Kathy's parents signed the papers gladly. They were eager to wash their hands of legal responsibility for their daughter. In their eyes, she was Randy's problem now. But the marriage was built on a foundation of desperation rather than love. It began to crumble almost immediately. Randy was young, unprepared for the responsibility of a wife. Kathy was even younger, carrying the trauma of her childhood like a weight around her neck. Less than a year into the marriage, Kathy discovered she was pregnant. On June 23, 1974, in a hospital room where she labored alone, Kathy gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Alexis. When the nurse placed the tiny infant in her arms, Kathy felt something she'd never experienced before: unconditional love. This tiny person depended on her completely, trusted her completely, loved her simply because she was her mother. For the first time in her life, Kathy felt needed. But love alone couldn't pay the bills. By the time Alexis was 5 months old, Kathy and Randy had separated. The marriage was over. Kathy returned to her parents' home in Virginia, carrying her baby and hoping against hope that maybe now, seeing their grandchild, her parents would soften. They didn't. Her mother barely looked at the baby. Her father made it clear that Kathy would receive no financial support, no help with childcare, no assistance of any kind. She was 18 years old, essentially homeless, with an infant who depended on her for everything. Kathy tried. She looked for work, but who would hire a teenage mother with no education and no references? She applied for government assistance, but the process was slow and the amount was barely enough to cover diapers, let alone rent and food. She reached out to Randy's family, but they had their own struggles. Every day was a battle. Every night, Kathy held Alexis and wondered how she could possibly give this child the life she deserved. The life Kathy herself had never had. When Alexis was 9 months old, Kathy made the hardest decision of her life. She contacted an adoption agency in Norfolk, Virginia. She explained her situation. They told her about families who were waiting, who had resources, who could provide stability. It took every ounce of strength Kathy had to sign those papers, to hand over her daughter to a social worker, to watch as the only person who'd ever truly loved her was carried away by a stranger. As Kathy walked out of the adoption agency that day, her arms empty, her heart shattered, she held on to one fragile hope, that one day, when Alexis was grown, she would understand. She would come looking for the mother who'd loved her enough to let her go. Kathy had no idea what kind of family was waiting to take her baby. She had no idea that her sacrifice would deliver Alexis not to a better life, but to a house of horrors. While Kathy was saying goodbye to her daughter, hundreds of miles away in Holland, Michigan, a couple was praying for a child to call their own. Dennis and Brenda Bowman presented themselves to the world as the picture of stability and devotion. Dennis, with his reddish-brown hair, neatly trimmed goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses, looked every bit the respectable working man. He was a former Navy reservist who now worked as a wood machinist, bringing home a steady paycheck. He was punctual, reliable, and skilled at his trade. Brenda was a heavy-set woman with carefully curled bangs who had worked the jewelry counter at the local Meyer department store before focusing her energy on making a home. She kept the house spotless, cooked hearty meals, and maintained the kind of domestic order that spoke of a woman who took pride in her role. Together, they were fixtures at their local church. They taught Sunday school to eager young children who hung on their every word. They volunteered for charity drives. They never missed a service. To their neighbors and fellow congregants, the Bowmans embodied Christian values: hard work, devotion, service. They desperately wanted to be parents. Brenda spoke often about her dream of holding a baby, of watching a child grow, of pouring love into a little life. But biology had placed a cruel barrier in their path. Brenda suffered from uterus didelphys, a rare congenital condition involving a double uterus. The condition made conception extraordinarily difficult, and carrying a pregnancy to term nearly impossible. Month after month, year after year, they faced disappointment. After extensive consultations with doctors who offered little hope, Dennis and Brenda turned to adoption. They filled out endless paperwork. They underwent home studies where social workers examined every corner of their lives. They provided references from their church, their employers, their neighbors. Everyone spoke glowingly of this devoted couple who would make wonderful parents. The adoption system, designed to protect children and place them in loving homes, saw exactly what Dennis and Brenda wanted them to see: a stable, religious, financially secure couple with strong community ties and an abundance of love to give. In late 1974, the system matched them with Kathy's 9-month-old daughter. The Bowmans drove to Norfolk, Virginia to meet the baby who would become theirs. When Brenda held the infant for the first time, she wept with joy. Dennis smiled, his hand on his wife's shoulder, the picture of a proud father-to-be. They brought the baby back to Michigan and renamed her Andrea Michelle Bowman. They had the name legally changed, erasing the identity of Alexis as completely as the closed adoption had erased Kathy's legal connection to her daughter. Before Andrea's first birthday, her past had been completely rewritten. She was now and forever a Bowman, growing up in the quiet, religious stability of rural Michigan. The very life Kathy had dreamed of for her child. But behind the closed doors of the Bowman home, away from the watchful eyes of the church community and curious neighbors, a different reality was taking shape. A reality that would eventually lead to a shallow grave in the backyard. ## Part 2. The childhood behind closed doors. For the first several years of Andrea's life, she was the sole focus of the Bowman household. Dennis and Brenda doted on their adopted daughter, dressing her in pretty dresses for church, teaching her Bible verses, bringing her to every social function. Andrea was a bright child with striking green eyes that seemed to look right through you. She had a gentle demeanor, quick to smile, eager to please. Teachers noted that she was well-behaved, polite, always completed her homework. On the surface, she seemed like any other child in their small Michigan community. But there were signs, if anyone had cared to look closely enough. Andrea was unusually quiet compared to other children her age. While her classmates chattered excitedly on the playground, Andrea often stood to the side, watching rather than participating. When other kids talked about weekend adventures or family trips, Andrea said little about life at home. Some teachers noticed that Andrea seemed anxious around authority figures, particularly men. She flinched at sudden movements. She apologized excessively, even for things that weren't her fault. But these were the 1980s in a small, religious community. Children were expected to be obedient, quiet, respectful. Andrea's behavior didn't ring alarm bells. If anything, she was held up as an example of how well-behaved a child could be. Then, in January 1988, everything changed. Against all medical odds, Brenda carried a pregnancy to term. On a cold winter day, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl with reddish hair and chubby cheeks. They named her Vanessa. The birth of Vanessa fundamentally altered Andrea's place in the family. Overnight, she went from being the cherished only child to something else entirely. At 13 years old, she became a third parent to her infant sister. While other girls her age were experiencing the normal turbulence of adolescence, joining clubs, attending dances, developing friendships, testing boundaries, Andrea's world shrank to the walls of the Bowman home. Her schedule became dictated by Vanessa's needs. Before school, Andrea changed diapers and prepared bottles. After school, while her classmates went to football games or hung out at the local diner, Andrea rushed home to help with the baby. Evenings were consumed with feeding, bathing, and soothing Vanessa. Weekends offered no respite. Dennis and Brenda framed this arrangement as teaching Andrea responsibility, preparing her for motherhood, instilling in her the values of service and sacrifice. But in reality, they had turned their teenage daughter into unpaid labor. Andrea never complained. Or rather, she never complained where anyone could hear her. She showed up to school exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from nights spent walking a colicky baby. She declined invitations to social events with explanations that she had to help at home. She withdrew further and further into herself. It was during this time that the whispers began in earnest. One morning in the fall of 1988, Andrea boarded the school bus with blood on her wrist. The cut was visible, angry-looking, impossible to miss. The bus erupted with speculation. Some students whispered that Andrea had tried to harm herself. They'd heard about such things on television, read about them in teen magazines. Troubled teenagers who turned pain inward when the world became too much to bear. Others claimed to know the real story, that Andrea had been locked out of her house as punishment and had cut herself trying to climb back in through a window. This version spread like wildfire because it confirmed what many already suspected, that something wasn't right in the Bowman household. When the bus arrived at school, a teacher noticed the injury and sent Andrea to the school nurse. The nurse cleaned and bandaged the wound, then asked how it happened. Andrea's explanation was vague, contradictory. First she said she'd fallen. Then she said she'd caught it on something sharp. She wouldn't meet the nurse's eyes. The nurse reported the incident to the administration. A note was made in Andrea's file. But nobody followed up. Nobody called Child Protective Services. Nobody demanded to speak with Andrea alone, away from her parents, in an environment where she might feel safe enough to tell the truth. The incident was logged and forgotten. Looking back now, with the hindsight that only tragedy provides, this was a missed opportunity. A moment where the system could have intervened. A chance to save Andrea before it was too late. But it didn't happen, and life in the Bowman home continued as before. The next warning sign came in November 1988, just a few months before Andrea's disappearance. Andrea confided in a teacher that she was afraid to go home. The teacher, alarmed by this admission, immediately reported it to the school administration. This time, the school took action. They sent a social worker to the Bowman residence to investigate. When the social worker arrived, Dennis and Brenda were ready. They greeted her warmly, invited her into their clean, well-maintained home. They offered her coffee. They expressed concern about Andrea's emotional state. Their explanation was smooth, practiced, plausible. Andrea had recently learned she was adopted. The revelation had upset her deeply. She was acting out, saying things to get attention, trying to process complex emotions in the way troubled teenagers do. They showed the social worker Andrea's room, neat, comfortable, filled with appropriate belongings. They showed her the family photos on the walls, the Bible on the coffee table, the normal trappings of a functioning household. The social worker interviewed Andrea briefly, but with Dennis and Brenda hovering nearby, Andrea said little. She nodded when her parents spoke. She didn't contradict their story. She seemed withdrawn, yes, but not in immediate danger. The social worker noted in her report that the family appeared stable, that Andrea's concerns seemed to stem from typical adolescent turmoil combined with the emotional impact of learning about her adoption. She recommended family counseling, but didn't mandate it. Once again, the system failed Andrea. The social worker had been in the house, had spoken to the girl who was afraid, and had walked away satisfied that everything was fine. Andrea was sent back to that house, back to Dennis and Brenda, back to whatever was happening behind those closed doors. For months later, she was gone. March 11th, 1989, started like any other Saturday in the Bowman household. The morning was cold, typical for Michigan in early spring. Patches of snow still clung to the shaded areas of the yard. The sky was that flat gray color that promises more cold days ahead. Dennis had volunteered to drive Andrea to the high school for a band event. Andrea played clarinet in the school band, one of the few extracurricular activities her parents allowed. She was a competent musician, not exceptional, but she enjoyed the sense of belonging that came from being part of something larger than herself. When Dennis picked her up that afternoon around 4 o'clock, something felt different. Several of Andrea's bandmates later recalled that she seemed tense as she got into the car. One friend said Andrea seemed reluctant to leave, that she'd lingered by the school entrance as if delaying the inevitable. The drive home was quiet. Dennis would later claim they didn't speak. Andrea sat in the passenger seat, her clarinet case on her lap, staring out the window at the passing landscape. What happened during that car ride, in the privacy of that vehicle, nobody knows. But it's likely that this was when whatever led to Andrea's death truly began. At approximately 5:30 that evening, Dennis drove Brenda to her second shift job. Brenda worked at a local manufacturing plant, a job that required her to be away from home from 6 in the evening until 11:30 at night. The extra income helped, and besides, with Andrea home to help with baby Vanessa, Brenda felt comfortable leaving. Dennis took 10-month-old Vanessa with him when he drove Brenda to work, telling Andrea to use the quiet time to focus on her homework. Andrea had schoolwork to complete, and without the baby demanding attention, she could concentrate. When Dennis returned home with Vanessa around 6:30 in the evening, the farmhouse was completely dark. Not a single light burned in any window. The silence was absolute, oppressive. The back door, which was typically locked, stood open. Dennis would later claim he found this concerning but not alarming. He said he assumed Andrea might have stepped outside for some reason and forgotten to close the door properly. He carried Vanessa into the house and placed her on the sofa in the living room. Then he called out for Andrea. No answer. He called again, louder this time. His voice echoed through the empty house. Still nothing. Dennis walked through the downstairs rooms, kitchen, dining room, living room, checking each one. Empty. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his footsteps creaking on the old wooden steps. At the top of the stairs, he noticed immediately that the master bedroom door was open. This was unusual. Dennis and Brenda kept their bedroom door locked at all times, a strict rule in the household. Andrea was never allowed in their room without explicit permission. Dennis entered the bedroom and immediately noticed things were missing. The small travel suitcase that Brenda kept on the top shelf of the closet was gone. Dennis opened his dresser drawer, where he kept the cash from their recent tax refund, several $100s they'd been saving. The money was gone. Even the coins from Vanessa's piggy bank, a ceramic elephant that sat on the nursery dresser, had been taken. On the bed lay Andrea's house key, deliberately placed, as if in symbolic rejection of the home. Dennis would claim that at this moment, he realized Andrea had run away. He said he immediately thought of the time several months earlier when Andrea had gone to a friend's house without permission after an argument with Brenda. But there was no sign of a struggle. No note. No indication of what had truly happened in those hours between 5:30 and 6:30. When Brenda's shift ended at 11:30 that night, she came home expecting to find Andrea asleep in her room and Dennis putting Vanessa to bed. Instead, Dennis met her at the door with news that their daughter was gone. Brenda's reaction was one of immediate panic. She demanded to know what had happened, how Andrea could just vanish. Dennis explained about the open door, the missing suitcase, the stolen money. Brenda refused to believe Andrea had simply left. Despite their difficulties, despite the tension in the household, Brenda believed Andrea was still her little girl. She thought there must be some explanation, some misunderstanding. That night, while Dennis stayed home with Vanessa, Brenda drove the dark country roads of Ottawa County. She drove slowly past cornfields and farmhouses, scanning the ditches and empty stretches of highway for any sign of her daughter. She checked the local truck stop, the 24-hour diner, the bus station. She asked strangers if they'd seen a 14-year-old girl with green eyes and brown hair. Nobody had. Brenda searched until the early morning hours, until exhaustion forced her to return home. She came back to find Dennis still awake, sitting at the kitchen table. He told her she needed to stop searching. They still had a baby to raise. Andrea had made her choice. They had to accept it and move forward. But Brenda couldn't accept it. Over the next several nights, she continued her solitary searches, driving the same roads, checking the same places, hoping against hope that Andrea would appear. Finally, Dennis put his foot down. He reminded Brenda that they had responsibilities. Vanessa needed her mother. The searches had to stop. On March 13th, 2 days after Andrea's disappearance, Dennis contacted the Holland Police Department to file a missing person report. He painted a very specific picture for the officers who took his statement. He described Andrea as a troubled teenager who frequently argued with her mother. He mentioned that she'd recently learned she was adopted and had been struggling with that information. He brought up the incident where she'd stayed at a friend's house without permission. He showed them the master bedroom where the suitcase and money had been taken. He gave them a description of what Andrea might be wearing. He provided them with a recent school photo. The officers who responded saw no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. The story Dennis told fit a familiar pattern they'd seen dozens of times. Rebellious teenager, strict household, simmering tensions finally boiling over. They classified Andrea as a runaway and passed her case to the Youth Services Bureau, a division that handled non-criminal matters involving juveniles. The official investigation, such as it was, essentially ended there. The police issued a bulletin with Andrea's description. They contacted the school and spoke briefly with Andrea's teachers and friends. They checked local youth shelters and contacted bus stations. But there was no intensive search. No search dogs combing the property. No deep dive into the family's background. No follow-up on the concerning reports that had been made about Andrea's fear of going home. The system had failed Andrea again. And this time, it was the final failure. In the absence of facts, rumors rushed in to fill the void. In the halls of Andrea's high school, students whispered theories. Some said she'd gone looking for her birth mother, that she'd become obsessed with finding the woman who gave her up. Others claimed she'd been seeing an older boyfriend and had run away with him. There were stories that she was pregnant, that she'd fled to avoid her parents' anger. In the Bowman's church community, the narrative was slightly different. There, people spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones about how difficult Andrea had been, how much Dennis and Brenda had struggled with her behavioral problems, how they'd done everything they could for an ungrateful child who'd ultimately rejected their love and guidance. At Dennis's workplace, co-workers offered their condolences and expressed hope that Andrea would return once she'd had time to cool off and realize how good she had it. In each of these spaces, the story being told was the same. Andrea had chosen to leave. She was troubled, rebellious, confused. Her disappearance was regrettable, but understandable. If you're finding this case as compelling as we did while researching it, do us a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Buried Secret Media so you don't miss cases like this. And make sure you turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear takes a turn nobody saw coming. Nobody questioned why a 14-year-old girl would steal her baby sister's piggy bank coins. Nobody wondered where she would go with no car, no driver's license, no connections outside Holland. Nobody thought it strange that a girl who'd shown no signs of planning to run away would suddenly vanish into thin air. And critically, nobody thought to ask, what if she never left at all? In the weeks following Andrea's disappearance, Brenda reported several potential sightings to police. Someone thought they saw Andrea at a rest stop 3 towns over. Another person claimed to have spotted her getting into a car with an older man. A truck driver reported giving a ride to a girl who might have been Andrea. Each lead was dutifully logged. Each one went nowhere. Shortly after the disappearance, the Bowmans made another significant decision. They moved. They left the farmhouse on Lincoln Road where they'd lived since Andrea was a baby and relocated to Hamilton, a small town nestled between Holland and Dorr. When neighbors asked about the move, Dennis explained that Brenda couldn't bear to be in the house anymore, seeing Andrea's empty room, being reminded of their missing daughter everywhere she looked. It was a plausible explanation. An understandable one. Nobody knew the real reason for the move. Nobody knew what Dennis had buried in the backyard before leaving. Nobody knew that when the moving truck was loaded, it carried more than just furniture and boxes. It carried a secret that would remain hidden for 31 years. In the months and years following Andrea's disappearance, her case slowly faded from local consciousness. Police hadn't generated any promising leads. The Youth Services Bureau had no active line of inquiry. Andrea's file gathered dust, one among thousands of missing persons cases across the country. A single photograph became Andrea's legacy, the school photo given to police when she first vanished. In it, Andrea sits against a blue studio backdrop, the kind used in school photos across America. She's wearing a simple blouse with a collar. Her brown hair is neatly styled, falling just past her shoulders. But it's her eyes that capture your attention. Those striking green eyes looking just off camera, cast slightly upward, as if she's looking towards something beyond the frame. There's something in those eyes that's hard to define. Not quite sadness, but not quite happiness either. A kind of resignation, perhaps. Or maybe we only see that now, knowing what we know. In the early 90s, photos of missing children appeared on milk cartons, on pizza delivery boxes, on billboards along highways. It was the era before social media, before Amber Alerts sent directly to cell phones. Finding missing children required saturation campaigns, getting their faces in front of as many people as possible. Andrea's photo made the rounds through these traditional channels. But it was one particular placement that would bring her face before millions of people. In 1993, the alternative rock band Soul Asylum released Runaway Train, a melancholic ballad about desperation and escape. The song resonated with the grunge era's themes of alienation and pain. But it was the music video that turned the song into a cultural phenomenon. Director Tony Kaye had a vision that went beyond simply illustrating the lyrics. He wanted to use the platform that MTV provided, millions of viewers, many of them young people, to do something meaningful. He decided to feature real missing children in the video. Working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Kaye obtained photographs and information about missing kids across America. Different versions of the video were created for different regions, each featuring children missing from that area. The version that aired in the Midwest featured Andrea Bowman. At 2 minutes and 7 seconds into the video, as lead singer Dave Pirner's voice croons about runaway trains and souls without direction, Andrea's school photo appears. Her name, her age when she disappeared, the date she went missing. For those few seconds, Andrea's face was broadcast into millions of homes. MTV viewers who might have been flipping channels, might have been paying half attention, might have been doing homework with the TV on in the background, saw her. They saw those green eyes. They saw her name. The Runaway Train video became one of MTV's most played videos of the year. It won numerous awards. And critically, it worked. According to director Tony Kaye, more than 24 of the children featured in various versions of the video were found and returned home safely. Andrea Bowman was not one of them. The video's success gave Brenda a brief surge of hope. She thought surely, with so many people seeing Andrea's photo, someone would recognize her. Someone would call in a tip that would bring her daughter home. The phone never rang with that call. As the months wore on, Runaway Train climbed down the charts. MTV played it less frequently. Eventually, it stopped airing altogether, replaced by newer videos, newer songs, newer concerns. Andrea's moment in the spotlight ended. Her case went cold again. The world moved on. But one person never stopped looking. One person never believed the runaway story. And that person was 700 miles away, with no legal standing, no resources, and no way of knowing that her daughter had never left Michigan at all. For Kathy Turkanian, the years after giving up her daughter were marked by a specific kind of grief, the grief of not knowing. She had no idea where Alexis was, what she looked like now, whether she was happy. The closed adoption meant she had no rights, no access to information, no way to check on the child she'd surrendered. Kathy tried to build a life. She eventually remarried, had other children. But there was always a part of her heart that belonged to the baby girl she'd given up when she was barely more than a child herself. She thought about Alexis on her birthday every year. She wondered if the family who adopted her celebrated it, if they baked a cake, if they made her feel special. She imagined what Alexis might look like at age 5, age 10, age 15. She never imagined that her daughter had been renamed. She never imagined that her daughter had disappeared. And she certainly never imagined that her daughter had been murdered and buried in a backyard. Then, in April 2010, everything changed. A letter arrived at Kathy's home in Virginia. The return address indicated it was from the Michigan State Police. Kathy's hands shook as she opened it. The letter explained that her biological daughter, whom she had named Alexis, had been adopted by a family named Bowman and renamed Andrea. It further explained that Andrea had been reported missing from her adoptive home in Holland, Michigan, in March 1989. The letter went on to describe a case from Wisconsin, an unidentified young woman found dead in Racine County in 1999. Investigators thought there might be a connection to Andrea and were requesting DNA from Kathy to compare against the Jane Doe. Kathy read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing fresh waves of shock and grief. Her daughter had disappeared 21 years ago, and she'd never known. For 2 decades, Kathy had been wondering about Alexis, imagining her living a good life with her adoptive family, hoping that one day she might seek out her birth mother. All that time, Alexis, Andrea, had been missing, possibly dead. Kathy immediately agreed to provide her DNA, but the letter left her with more questions than answers. She needed to know more. She needed to understand what had happened to her daughter. Kathy turned to the internet, searching for any information she could find about Andrea Bowman. She found the school photo, the girl with green eyes looking off camera. Kathy stared at that photo for hours. She searched for traces of herself in Andrea's features, the shape of her face, the tilt of her chin. She felt an instant, visceral connection to this girl she'd never known. She found mentions of Andrea's case on cold case forums, brief paragraphs on missing persons databases. But there was frustratingly little information. Andrea had been classified as a runaway. There was no indication of ongoing investigation. Kathy joined Web Sleuths, the same forum where Carl Koppelman spent his time. She started reading everything she could about Andrea's case. She connected with Carl, who was gracious and helpful, sharing what he knew about the Racine County Jane Doe theory. But Kathy needed more than theories. She needed to know who had raised her daughter. She needed to understand the family she'd entrusted Alexis to all those years ago. Through her research, she found a name, Pat O'Reilly, a retired detective from Michigan who had worked missing persons cases. She reached out to him, explaining who she was and asking if he knew anything about the Bowman family. O'Reilly's response was not what Kathy hoped for. Instead of reassuring her that Andrea had been placed in a good home, O'Reilly pointed her toward the dark history of Dennis Bowman. He suggested she file a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain Dennis's criminal records. When those documents arrived in Kathy's mailbox several weeks later, they shattered any remaining illusions about the life her daughter had lived. The file was thick, filled with police reports, court documents, and psychological evaluations that painted a disturbing picture of the man who had raised her daughter. Kathy learned about the 1979 incident where Dennis had bound and restrained a woman in her home. She read the police sketch that matched Dennis's description. She saw his confession. But it was the 1980 case that truly horrified her. In May of that year, just months after Dennis and Brenda had adopted baby Andrea, Dennis had forced a 19-year-old woman off her bicycle and ordered her at gunpoint to walk into the woods. The young woman had refused to move, even when Dennis fired warning shots. Only the passing of a car had saved her from whatever Dennis had planned. Kathy read the trial transcripts. She saw the judge's statement that Dennis would likely pose a danger to women if released. She saw that Dennis had been sentenced to 5 to 10 years, but had served only the minimum. And critically, she saw the dates. Dennis had been released from prison in the mid-80s. He had been free when Andrea was growing up. He had been her father, the man entrusted with protecting her. Kathy read further and found more incidents. The 1998 case where Dennis had stalked Vicky Vandenbrink, breaking into her home, stealing her intimate belongings, cutting a slit in her curtains to watch her. With each page Kathy turned, her horror grew. This was the man who had raised her daughter. This was the stable, loving home the adoption agency had placed Alexis in. Kathy's grief transformed into conviction. Andrea hadn't run away. No 14-year-old girl would willingly disappear from her home, taking only a suitcase and some cash, leaving no trace behind. Not when she had a father with a history of violence against women. The runaway theory crumbled. In its place, a terrible certainty. Andrea was dead. and Dennis Bowman had killed her. With this new understanding, Kathy became obsessed with finding Andrea's remains. She believed that Dennis had buried Andrea somewhere, and that finding her was the key to proving what had happened. Kathy spent hours on Google Earth, examining satellite imagery of Dennis and Brenda's property on 134th Avenue in Salem Township. She zoomed in and out, studied every shadow, every discoloration in the earth. And then she found it, a patch of disturbed earth in the backyard. The ground there looked different from the surrounding area, slightly sunken, the grass a different shade of green, as if something had disrupted the soil and it had never quite recovered. Kathy became convinced this was Andrea's grave. She contacted Michigan authorities, pleading with them to search the property. She sent them screenshots from Google Earth, arrows pointing to the suspicious area. She explained Dennis's criminal history, the timeline of Andrea's disappearance, all the reasons why this wasn't a simple runaway case. The police listened politely, but they needed more than satellite images and a birth mother's intuition. They needed evidence. They needed probable cause for a search warrant. Carl Koppelman, applying his knowledge of criminal profiling, actually disagreed with Kathy's theory. He argued that it would be extraordinarily risky for someone to dig up a body and relocate it to a new property. Most criminals, he explained, didn't take those kinds of chances. If Andrea had been killed at the old farmhouse on Lincoln Road, Carl believed she was still there. But police found no grounds to search either property. The homeowners at Lincoln Road had no connection to the case and refused permission for a search. Dennis and Brenda, living at the 134th Avenue property, certainly weren't going to consent. The harshest reality Kathy faced was her complete lack of legal standing. The closed adoption meant that in the eyes of the law, she was not Andrea's mother. She had no parental rights, no legal basis to demand action. She was just a woman with a theory, and theories weren't enough. In 2013, the DNA results finally came back. Kathy was not related to the Racine County Jane Doe. For Carl Koppelman, it was disappointing but not devastating. The Jane Doe would eventually be identified through other means, and he would move on to other cases. For Kathy, the news was both heartbreaking and clarifying. It meant Andrea hadn't survived for 10 years after disappearing, but it also strengthened Kathy's conviction about what had really happened. Andrea had never left Michigan. She'd never made it past that March night in 1989. Kathy continued her online advocacy, posting about Andrea's case on social media, keeping her daughter's story alive. And it was these posts that would eventually bring her face to face with the woman who had raised her daughter. September 2013. The Missing in Michigan Conference was held annually in Lansing, bringing together families of missing persons, law enforcement officials, and cold case enthusiasts. Kathy and Carl decided to attend. They had custom t-shirts made with Andrea's photo and the words, "Find Andrea Bowman," printed across the front. They hoped to generate new leads, to keep Andrea's case in the public eye. As Carl scanned the room during a break between sessions, he suddenly grabbed Kathy's arm. "That's them," he whispered. Kathy followed his gaze. Across the room stood a red-haired young woman in her mid-20s and an older, heavy-set woman with curled bangs. Vanessa and Brenda Bowman. Kathy's heart raced. This was the woman who had raised her daughter. The woman who had been Andrea's mother for 14 years. The woman married to a violent predator. Brenda had spotted them too. She'd seen Kathy's social media posts accusing Dennis. She knew exactly who this woman was. To Kathy's surprise, Brenda approached them. Not with hostility, but with an almost eager defensiveness. "You don't understand," Brenda began, her voice tight. "Dennis and I cooperated fully with the police. We did everything we could." She had brought a binder, thick with notes, flyers, newspaper clippings, documentation of their efforts to find Andrea. She showed it to Kathy and Carl as if it were proof of innocence. Carl, ever the diplomat, gently raised the issue of Dennis's criminal history. "What about the conviction? What about the other women?" Brenda's response was delivered with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed. "I haven't forgotten what Dennis did, but I forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously, for better or worse." Kathy searched Brenda's face for any sign that she suspected the truth, that some part of her knew what Dennis had done. But all she saw was absolute, unwavering loyalty. Brenda believed in Dennis's innocence with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction. The conversation was brief and ultimately fruitless. Brenda was a wall, impenetrable, protecting her husband from accusations she would never allow herself to believe. As Brenda and Vanessa walked away, Kathy felt a crushing sense of defeat. How do you find truth when everyone who might know it refuses to see? With Brenda standing as a firewall between Dennis and justice, the investigation in Michigan remained stalled. Dennis Bowman remained a free man, protected by his wife's forgiveness and the lack of physical evidence. But the answer to Andrea's disappearance wasn't going to come from Michigan. It was going to come from 700 miles away, from a case that had been cold for nearly 4 decades, from a woman named Kathleen Doyle, who had been waiting for justice since 1980. The breakthrough that would eventually crack Andrea's case had nothing to do with Michigan. It had everything to do with genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that was transforming cold case investigations across America. 1980. Norfolk, Virginia. Late summer, heat hung heavy over the naval base town. Kathleen O'Brien Doyle was 25 years old, newly married, and deeply in love. She'd met Stephen Doyle through mutual friends, and they'd married quickly in that breathless way of military couples who know deployment could come at any time. They'd been married only 5 months when Stephen's orders came through. He was assigned to the USS Eisenhower, an aircraft carrier preparing for deployment. The assignment meant months at sea, months of separation. Kathleen assured him she'd be fine. She was independent, capable. She'd keep busy with work and friends. They'd write letters. The time would pass. Stephen left, and Kathleen settled into the solitude of the military wife. She kept up the small house they rented. She took care of her orange tabby cat. She wrote long letters to Stephen describing her days, filling the pages with stories that would help him feel less far away. By September, her letters stopped arriving. At first, Stephen thought it might be the mail system. Letters from home were notoriously unreliable when ships were deployed. But when weeks passed with no word from Kathleen, Stephen began making calls. He asked friends to check on his wife, to make sure she was okay. On September 11th, 1980, 2 of those friends went to the house. The front door was locked. They knocked. No answer. They called through the windows. Silence. They found a spare key and let themselves in, calling Kathleen's name. The orange cat came to greet them, meowing desperately, clearly hungry and distressed. They found Kathleen in the bedroom. The scene was one of absolute horror. Kathleen's body showed signs of a prolonged, brutal attack. She'd been bound with cords. The room had been ransacked, furniture overturned, belongings scattered. The medical examiner would later determine that Kathleen had passed sometime between 7:30 in the evening and midnight on September 9th or 10th. She'd lain there for hours, possibly more than a day, while her killer walked free and her cat cried for food. The investigation began immediately. Norfolk police processed the scene, collecting evidence, taking photographs, interviewing neighbors. But nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything. The house sat on a quiet street, where people minded their own business. Biological evidence was collected from the scene, from Kathleen's body, from the bedding, from the floor. This was 1980. DNA analysis didn't exist as a forensic tool yet. But investigators preserved the evidence carefully, hoping that someday, technology might catch up to their needs. With no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear motive, Kathleen's purse and jewelry were untouched, ruling out robbery. The investigation quickly stalled. In 1984, hope arrived from an unexpected source, a death row inmate in Texas named Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas had gained national notoriety for confessing to hundreds of murders across the United States. He claimed to have killed his own mother, his teenage girlfriend, and countless women he'd encountered during years of drifting from state to state. Law enforcement agencies across the country contacted Lucas, hoping he might provide information about their unsolved cases. Norfolk police were among them. Lucas claimed to remember Kathleen Doyle. He provided details about the crime that seemed to match the scene. He described the house, the victim, aspects of the attack. He even implicated his traveling companion, Otis Toole. Norfolk investigators flew to Texas to interview Lucas in person. They came away convinced they had their man. They prepared to charge both Lucas and Toole with Kathleen's murder. Then, as quickly as he'd confessed, Lucas recanted. He told investigators he'd made the whole thing up. He admitted he'd lied deliberately, claiming he wanted to embarrass law enforcement to prove he could manipulate them. The confession collapsed. The case against Lucas and Toole fell apart. Investigators were left with nothing but the same cold evidence they'd started with. Kathleen's case went back into the filing cabinet. Years passed. Decades passed. Technology evolved. DNA analysis became routine in criminal investigations. But without a suspect to compare the DNA to, the evidence sat unused. Until 2018, when a cold case detective named Jonathan Smith decided to try something new. Detective Smith had been following the Golden State Killer case with intense interest. Joseph DeAngelo, a former police officer who had terrorized California with a spree of rapes and murders in the 70s and 80s, had been identified and arrested in 2018 using genetic genealogy. Investigators had uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database called GeneMatch. The database compared the DNA to millions of family trees, identifying distant relatives. From there, genealogists built out family trees, narrowing down potential suspects until they identified DeAngelo. It was revolutionary, and it meant that cold cases with preserved DNA could potentially be solved even without a suspect in hand. Smith decided to apply the same technique to Kathleen Doyle's case. He sent samples from the crime scene to a genealogy company specializing in forensic work. The process took time, nearly a year of analysis, tree building, and elimination. But eventually, Smith received results, a list of 32 names. These weren't direct matches, but distant relatives that shared genetic markers with the unknown subject. Genealogists began constructing family trees, following lineages forward and backward through time. They looked for men who would have been the right age in 1980. They looked for connections to Norfolk, Virginia. At the center of one particularly promising family tree was a name that meant nothing to Norfolk investigators: Dennis Lee Bowman. Smith started researching. A simple Google search revealed Dennis's criminal history in Michigan. Smith's attention sharpened when he read about the May 1980 conviction, the attempted abduction of a cyclist at gunpoint, the judge's statement about Dennis being a danger to women. May 1980, just 4 months before Kathleen Doyle's murder. Smith dug deeper and discovered something else. Dennis Bowman's adopted daughter had disappeared in 1989 under mysterious circumstances. The pieces were starting to align in a way that made Smith's investigative instincts sing. This wasn't just a potential match. This was a pattern. Smith attended a cold case conference where he knew Michigan investigators would be present. He sought out a detective sergeant from Michigan State Police and asked directly, "What can you tell me about Dennis Bowman?" The sergeant's response was immediate and unequivocal. "I know Dennis. I know his family. He's probably your guy." Armed with this confirmation, Smith returned to Michigan records. He obtained court transcripts from Dennis's 1980 trial. The documents confirmed that Dennis had been in Norfolk on a 2-week Naval Reserve training deployment during the exact window when Kathleen Doyle was murdered. Dennis had been in Norfolk. He had access to the area. He had a history of violence against women. And his DNA was a familial match to evidence from the scene. Smith needed a direct DNA sample from Dennis to confirm the match. But he couldn't just ask Dennis to provide one. That would alert him to the investigation and potentially give him time to flee or destroy evidence. Smith contacted the Allegan County Sheriff's Office in Michigan to coordinate a covert DNA collection. They began planning surveillance, waiting for Dennis to discard something they could collect: a coffee cup, a water bottle, a cigarette. But before they could execute their plan, Dennis and Brenda Bowman walked into the sheriff's office on their own. It was late October 2019. Dennis and Brenda arrived at the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to file a formal complaint. They were upset about Kathy Turkanian's social media posts. They claimed she was harassing them, making false accusations, damaging Dennis's reputation. The officers who met with them managed to keep their expressions neutral, professional. They invited Dennis and Brenda into an interview room to discuss the complaint. During the meeting, one of the officers offered Dennis a bottle of water from a pack they kept for visitors. "Would you like some water while we talk?" Dennis accepted without hesitation. He was thirsty from the drive. He drank freely while explaining his grievances against Kathy, taking long swallows between sentences. When the meeting ended, Dennis and Brenda left, satisfied that their complaint had been heard and would be addressed. The officers waited until the Bowman's car disappeared from the parking lot. Then they carefully collected the water bottle Dennis had used, handling it with gloves, sealing it in an evidence bag. The bottle was sent to the lab with priority processing. Weeks passed. Smith waited, knowing that this could be the evidence that broke the case wide open or the dead end that sent him back to square one. Then the call came. The DNA from the water bottle was a match to the biological evidence from Kathleen Doyle's murder scene. After 39 years, they had their killer. November 2019. The arrest team from Norfolk flew to Michigan. Dennis Bowman, now 70 years old, was at home when police arrived. He answered the door to find multiple officers, some in uniform, some in plain clothes. They had a warrant for his arrest. As the lead officer read Dennis's rights, Brenda emerged from deeper in the house. Her reaction was immediate and desperate. "You've got the wrong person," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "This is impossible. Dennis wasn't even in Virginia in 1980. An officer gently tried to explain that they had evidence placing Dennis in Norfolk at the time of the murder. They had his military records confirming his deployment there. Brenda refused to hear it. She physically tried to put herself between the officers and Dennis. "He would never do something like that. You don't understand. Dennis is a good man. He helps at the church. He volunteers. He's devoted to his family." One officer had to carefully move Brenda aside so they could handcuff Dennis. She followed them to the door, still protesting, still insisting they were making a terrible mistake. "Dennis, I believe you," she called out as they led him to the patrol car. "I'll hire the best lawyer I can. We're going to prove you're innocent. This is all just a misunderstanding." Dennis, for his part, remained silent. He didn't protest. He didn't proclaim his innocence. He simply allowed himself to be led away, his expression unreadable behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He was transferred to the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, where he would be held while awaiting extradition to Virginia. That's when the real work began. Investigator Jonathan Smith had flown to Michigan specifically to interrogate Dennis. He'd studied everything he could about the man, his background, his crimes, his psychology. He knew this interview was critical not just for the Virginia case, but potentially for Andrea's disappearance as well. Smith made a calculated decision about how to approach the interrogation. He removed his badge and gun before entering the room, leaving them with another officer. He wanted to create an atmosphere that felt less adversarial, more conversational. When Smith entered the interrogation room, Dennis was sitting at a small table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked up as Smith entered, but didn't speak. "Hi, Dennis," Smith said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "I'm Detective Jonathan Smith from Norfolk. I want to talk to you about what happened in Virginia in 1980. But before we get to that, I want to understand you better. Can you tell me about yourself?" It was a technique Smith had used before. Get the subject talking about themselves first, build rapport, create a false sense of comfort. Dennis hesitated, then began to speak. He talked about his childhood, describing his parents in bitter terms. His father had been harsh, critical, impossible to please. His mother had been distant, cold. Nothing Dennis did was ever good enough. Smith listened, asking follow-up questions, showing empathy. "That must have been difficult, growing up feeling like you weren't valued." Dennis nodded, seeming to appreciate being heard. Smith gradually steered the conversation toward Dennis's interests. "I understand you collect knives. Is that right?" Dennis's eyes lit up slightly. He described his fascination with bladed weapons, the craftsmanship, the history, the beauty of a well-made knife. He had dozens of them, he explained, each one chosen carefully. "Tell me about that night in Norfolk," Smith said, his tone casual, as if he were asking about a trip to the grocery store rather than a murder. Dennis was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He admitted he'd been in Norfolk for a Naval Reserve training deployment. He said he'd felt stressed, isolated from everyone he knew. One night, he decided to leave the base to clear his head. "I went to a bar," Dennis said. "I drank too much. More than I should have. I wasn't thinking clearly." He claimed he wandered the streets, disoriented, until he spotted a house with no lights on and no car in the driveway. On impulse, he decided to break in, thinking he might find money or valuables. "I went inside," Dennis continued, his voice flat, emotionless. "I was looking through the rooms when I opened a door, and there she was. This woman." She started screaming. According to Dennis's account, he covered her mouth with his left hand to quiet her, his right hand holding a pocket knife he'd brought for protection. He claimed when he pushed her, she grabbed at his hand, and the knife accidentally penetrated her. "I left right away," Dennis said. "She was still moving, still on the bed. I told her I was leaving. It was a sanitized version of events that bore little resemblance to the crime scene Smith knew. Dennis mentioned nothing about the cords used to bind Kathleen, nothing about the prolonged nature of the attack, nothing about the other injuries documented in the autopsy report. "What were you feeling during this?" Smith asked. Dennis's demeanor changed. He looked down at the table, his hands beginning to shake. "It wasn't me," he whispered. "It was the demon." "What demon, Dennis?" "The one inside me. The one that takes over sometimes. I can't control it when it comes out." Dennis's behavior shifted dramatically. His face contorted. His voice changed, becoming deeper, more guttural. He seemed almost possessed. "Draw it for me," Smith said, sliding a notepad and pen across the table. "Show me this demon." Dennis picked up the pen and began to draw. The image that emerged was crude but disturbing. A creature with horns, a pointed beard, wild eyes. He labeled it, pressing so hard with the pen that the paper tore slightly. "This is what's inside me," Dennis said. "This is what wanted to get out." Smith let him continue drawing, watching carefully. Then he confronted Dennis with the physical evidence, the bindings, the multiple stab wounds, the clear signs that this was no accident. Dennis shut down. "I don't remember that," he said, his voice reverting to its normal tone. "I only remember what I told you. The rest is blank." He refused to make eye contact, his shoulders hunching, his entire posture becoming childlike. Smith pressed harder, but Dennis had retreated behind a wall. He kept repeating that he couldn't remember, that he'd told Smith everything he knew. Eventually, Smith left the room to review his notes and consider his next approach. The cameras in the interrogation room kept recording. #### the admission. Alone in the room, Dennis began muttering to himself. The audio was faint, but the cameras picked it up. At first, the words were denials. "I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do that." He said it over and over, like a mantra or a prayer, rocking slightly in his chair. Then, abruptly, the words changed. "I did it again," Dennis whispered. "I did it again. I did it again." Those 4 words would change everything. When Smith reviewed the footage, he immediately understood the significance. Again meant there was another time, another victim, another crime. Smith and his colleagues from Virginia immediately contacted Michigan investigators. They shared the footage, the admission. Michigan detectives knew exactly what again meant. It meant Andrea. Dennis Bowman was now confirmed as Kathleen Doyle's killer. But the leverage they had over him, the possibility of extradition to Virginia versus staying in Michigan, became the key to finally finding out what happened to Andrea Bowman. With Dennis in custody for Kathleen Doyle's murder, Michigan investigators had a narrow window to solve Andrea's case. Once Dennis was extradited to Virginia and sentenced to life in prison there, any leverage they had would evaporate. He'd have no incentive to talk about Andrea. Investigators needed to move quickly. They obtained search warrants for the property on 134th Avenue where Dennis and Brenda currently lived. They brought in cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains even years after burial. The dogs searched the entire property, the house, the yard, the outbuildings. They circled the backyard multiple times. But they didn't alert. Either there was nothing there, or the remains had been too well concealed. Brenda remained steadfast in her loyalty. When investigators questioned her about Andrea's disappearance, she insisted on the runaway story. Andrea had been troubled. She'd left on her own. Dennis had nothing to do with it. Investigators knew they needed to break through either Dennis or Brenda. They decided to appeal to the one thing Dennis seemed to care about, proximity to his family. They crafted a deal. If Dennis revealed the location of Andrea's body, he could serve his time in a Michigan prison where Brenda and Vanessa could visit him regularly. If he refused to cooperate, he would be sent to Virginia immediately, where he would die in prison, alone, never seeing his family again. Initially, Dennis refused. He maintained he had nothing to do with Andrea's disappearance. But as the reality of life imprisonment in Virginia, far from Brenda, sank in, Dennis began to waver. He had one condition. He wanted to speak to Brenda before telling investigators anything. Detectives agreed. They arranged a meeting in an interrogation room, making sure all cameras and audio equipment were recording. Before Brenda arrived, Dennis looked directly at one of the cameras, as if checking to make sure it was on. This was going to be a performance, carefully crafted for the record. When Brenda entered the room, she rushed to Dennis, taking his hands. "I don't believe any of this," she said. I know you didn't hurt Andrea. Dennis looked at his wife, this woman who had stood by him through arrests, convictions, years of his predatory behavior. Brenda, he said softly, I need to tell you something. Andrea's been gone since the day she disappeared. Brenda shook her head. No, she ran away. She's out there somewhere. She's not, Dennis said. She died that day. It was an accident. He proceeded to tell Brenda a story that investigators immediately recognized as another sanitized version of events designed to minimize his culpability. According to Dennis, he came home with Vanessa that evening to find Andrea packing a bag. When he confronted her, she became angry and threatened to tell her therapist again that he'd been inappropriate with her. We argued, Dennis said. I reached out to stop her from leaving, and I pushed her. She fell backward down the stairs. When I got to her, her head was tilted funny. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't breathing. There was no pulse. Dennis claimed he panicked. He knew if Andrea was found dead in the house, he'd be blamed. He'd go to prison and lose Brenda forever. So I wrapped her in a blanket. He continued, his voice emotionless. I hid her in the barn for a few days while I figured out what to do. Then I put her in a cardboard barrel and placed it with the neighbor's trash. I thought she'd be taken to the landfill and cremated. Brenda was crying, her face in her hands. But when she looked up, her words shocked the investigators watching. I forgive you. I still love you. We'll get through this together. Investigators reviewed the interrogation with deep skepticism. The story about the trash pickup seemed implausible. It would have required Dennis to risk his neighbors seeing him place a heavy barrel in their trash. It would have required the barrel to go unnoticed by trash collectors. But more importantly, they began intercepting letters Dennis sent to Brenda from jail. And those letters told a very different story. In a letter dated December 12, 2019, Dennis wrote, I need to tell you the truth. I didn't put her in the trash like I said. I put her in a private cemetery. In another letter, he described Andrea's burial in haunting detail. He wrote about the clothes she'd been wearing, jeans, her favorite sweater, a gold necklace. He mentioned that in the 30 years since her burial, he'd walked past her grave more than 100 times. Every time I mowed the lawn, he wrote, I knew she was right there. The letters contradicted his confession. Investigators confronted Dennis with the discrepancies. Dennis, realizing he'd been caught in the lie, initially refused to say more. I'll take it to my grave, he told them. Investigators turned their pressure to Brenda. They explained the reality. The deal required him to reveal Andrea's location. Without that information, there was no deal. Dennis would be sent to Virginia immediately. They appealed to Brenda's desire to give Andrea a proper burial, a final resting place in a cemetery rather than wherever Dennis had hidden her. Under this combined pressure, Brenda pleaded with Dennis to tell the truth. She wrote him letters. She called him. She begged him to do the right thing, to let Andrea be properly laid to rest. Finally, Dennis relented. The truth he revealed was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Dennis admitted he'd lied about the trash. Andrea had never been taken to a landfill. When Andrea died, and Dennis still maintained it was an accident from falling down the stairs, though investigators strongly doubted this. Dennis had initially buried her in the backyard of their rental home on Lincoln Road. He'd dug the grave at night while Brenda was at work and Vanessa was asleep. He'd wrapped Andrea's body in trash bags, placed used diapers around her to mask any scent should anyone search with dogs, and buried her in a shallow grave. For the next several months, Andrea remained there while Dennis and Brenda went about their lives. While Brenda drove the roads searching for her runaway daughter, Andrea was buried in their own backyard. When the Bowmans decided to move to 134th Avenue in Hamilton, Dennis faced a problem. He couldn't leave Andrea behind. New owners might renovate the yard, install a pool, plant a garden. Her remains might be discovered. So Dennis did the unthinkable. Under cover of darkness, months after the initial burial, Dennis dug up Andrea's remains. He transported them to the new property and reburied them in the backyard there. He'd moved his victim with him, kept her close, maintained control over her even in death. For 30 years, Andrea had been in that backyard. For 30 years, Dennis had walked past her grave regularly, knowing exactly where she was. For 30 years, he'd maintained the lie while Brenda mourned and Kathy searched, and investigators looked everywhere except the most obvious place. Dennis pointed to the exact spot on a property map. The location was chilling in its precision. It was the exact patch of disturbed earth that Kathy Turkanian had identified on Google Earth years earlier. The spot police had dismissed as coincidence and maternal desperation. A mother's intuition had been right all along. Police returned to the property on 134th Avenue with excavators, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of forensic anthropologists. Brenda and Vanessa were required to vacate the property during the search. Brenda left reluctantly, still maintaining that Dennis must be confused, that Andrea couldn't possibly be buried in their yard. The excavation began in the early morning of a cold November day. The machines moved slowly, carefully, removing layers of soil inch by inch. Investigators didn't want to disturb any evidence more than necessary. At approximately 4 feet down, the excavator operator signaled a stop. Something in the soil had changed. The forensic team moved in with hand tools, brushes, cameras. They found a large black trash bag. Inside it were 4 smaller bags. And inside those smaller bags were used diapers, yellowed with age, giving off a faint but unmistakable odor even after all these years. Beneath the diapers, the team found what they'd been looking for: skeletal remains, partially decomposed clothing, and a few personal items that had survived 3 decades underground. Among the items was a candy wrapper. When forensic analysts examined it later, they could still make out the date stamp, 1989. Andrea had been wrapped in her favorite sweater, just as Dennis had described. She was wearing jeans. Around what remained of her neck was a tarnished gold necklace. The remains were carefully extracted, photographed, cataloged. Every piece of evidence was documented for the inevitable trial. DNA analysis would later confirm what everyone already knew. These were the remains of Andrea Michelle Bowman, missing since March 11, 1989. The girl who everyone thought had run away had been in her backyard the entire time. When investigators informed Brenda that they'd found Andrea's remains, her reaction was complex. She wept, deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Whether she was crying for Andrea, for herself, for the life she'd built on lies, nobody could say. But even then, even with Andrea's body recovered, even with Dennis's confession, Brenda called her husband in jail. The call was recorded. "Nothing's changed," Brenda told him, her voice still shaky from crying. "I still love you. We'll get through this." Dennis, for his part, sounded almost relieved. The secret he'd carried for 30 years was finally out. The burden of maintaining the lie was lifted. To the investigators listening to the call, Brenda's loyalty seemed incomprehensible. How could she still love a man who had murdered her daughter and buried her in their backyard? How could she forgive that? But Brenda's identity was entirely bound up in being Dennis's wife. To acknowledge the full truth of who Dennis was would mean acknowledging that her entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies and violence. It would mean accepting that she'd chosen her husband over her daughter, that she'd defended a monster. For Brenda, it was easier to forgive the unforgivable than to face that reality. Following the discovery of Andrea's remains, Dennis began admitting to other crimes. He confessed to multiple incidents in San Diego during his Navy years, before he'd even met Brenda. Attacks on women, stalking, break-ins. Some of these had been reported at the time, but with no identified suspect, the cases had gone cold. He admitted to the trailer park incident in the early 80s where he'd harmed another woman. Investigators began to wonder, if Dennis had been active since the late 70s, if he'd killed at least twice that they knew of, Kathleen in 1980 and Andrea in 1989, how many other victims might there be? They examined unsolved murders of women in areas where Dennis had lived or traveled. They looked at missing persons cases from time periods when Dennis was unaccounted for. They reached out to law enforcement agencies across the country. But Dennis wasn't confessing to anything else. He maintained that Kathleen and Andrea were his only victims. Whether that was true or whether he was protecting himself from additional charges, nobody could say for certain. The full extent of Dennis Bowman's crimes may never be fully known. On February 7, 2022, Dennis Bowman appeared before a judge in Michigan for sentencing in Andrea's case. He had pleaded no contest to second-degree murder. No contest meant he wasn't admitting guilt, but he acknowledged that the prosecution had sufficient evidence to convict him. The courtroom was packed. Kathy Turkanian was there, sitting in the front row, seeing the man who had killed her daughter for the first time in person. Brenda was there too, still standing by her husband, still maintaining her loyalty. Members of Andrea's extended family attended. Cold case enthusiasts who'd followed the case online came to witness this moment of justice. The judge, a veteran of the bench with decades of experience, spoke before pronouncing sentence. His words were careful, measured, but clearly emotional. "In my 30 years on this bench," he said, "I have seen many disturbing cases, but few have been as calculated, as deceptive, as fundamentally cruel as this one. For 30 years, you maintained a lie. You allowed a mother to search for a daughter you knew was dead. You walked past that child's grave every day and felt no compulsion to give her a proper burial. You are, sir, a danger to every woman who crosses your path." He sentenced Dennis to 35 to 50 years in prison for Andrea's murder. Under the plea agreement, Dennis would serve his time first in Michigan, allowing Brenda and Vanessa to visit. But afterward, or if he outlived his Michigan sentence, he would be transferred to Virginia to serve 2 consecutive life sentences for Kathleen Doyle's murder. The mathematics were simple. Dennis Bowman, now 74 years old, would die in prison. He would never walk free. He would never harm another woman. As deputies led Dennis from the courtroom, he glanced once at Brenda. She was crying but mouthed the words, "I love you." He showed no emotion as he was taken away. In the aftermath of the trial, Brenda made a decision that would inflict one final wound on Kathy Turkanian. Brenda claimed Andrea's remains. As the adoptive mother, she had the legal right to make decisions about burial. She had Andrea cremated. Then, in what she apparently viewed as a generous gesture, she sent a letter to Kathy offering her half of Andrea's ashes. For Kathy, this was devastating. Her daughter had been split in half by the adoption, half her biological child, half the Bowman's adoptive daughter. Now, even in death, Andrea was being divided. Kathy accepted the ashes, but struggled with what to do with them. How do you properly honor someone you never got to know? How do you mourn a daughter who was taken from you as a baby and returned to you as ashes? The pain of it was almost unbearable. Kathy had given up her baby hoping to give her a better life. Instead, that decision had delivered Alexis to a monster. The sacrifice Kathy had made, the most painful choice of her life, had been for nothing. No, worse than nothing. It had delivered her daughter to her death. Today, Dennis Bowman, now 75 years old, is incarcerated at the River North Correctional Center in Virginia. He receives occasional visits from Brenda and Vanessa, though these have become less frequent as the years pass. Brenda still lives in Michigan. She still maintains her marriage to Dennis. She still attends the same Catholic church where Dennis once volunteered and where Father O'Connell once wrote a character reference praising his devotion. The property on 134th Avenue has been sold. The new owners know its history. The spot where Andrea was buried has been left undisturbed, marked now only by a slight depression in the grass. The farmhouse on Lincoln Road, where Andrea died, still stands. It's gone through several owners since the Bowmans left. None of them knew about the violence that occurred there until the case made headlines. Kathy Turkanian continues to live in Virginia. She's become an advocate for adoption reform, arguing for more open adoptions where birth parents have some ability to check on their children's welfare. She speaks at conferences about her experience, hoping to prevent other children from falling through the cracks the way Andrea did. Carl Koppelman continues his work with cold cases, creating reconstructions of unidentified remains, trying to give names to the nameless. And Andrea? Andrea Bowman exists now in photographs and memories, in court records and news articles. The girl with green eyes looking off camera, forever 14, forever frozen in that moment before everything went wrong. Looking back at Andrea's case, the failures are systemic and numerous. The adoption agency that placed a baby with a man who had already shown violent tendencies toward women. The judge who sentenced Dennis to only 5 years despite acknowledging he was a danger. The prison system that released him after the minimum sentence. The social worker who accepted Dennis and Brenda's explanation and sent Andrea back to that house. The police who immediately classified her as a runaway without deeper investigation. The community that saw signs of abuse but looked away. At every point where the system could have protected Andrea, it failed her. But perhaps the greatest failure was one of imagination. For 30 years, everyone asked, where did Andrea go? They searched other towns, other states. They imagined her living a secret life somewhere far away. Nobody asked the one question that mattered. What if she never left? The answer was there the whole time, 6 feet under the backyard. waiting to be discovered. But it took 30 years, a murder in Virginia, genetic genealogy, and a mother's unshakable conviction before anyone thought to look. Andrea Bowman deserved better. She deserved a childhood free from fear. She deserved parents who protected her instead of preyed on her. She deserved to grow up, to discover who she was, to fall in love, to live the life her birth mother had dreamed for her. Instead, she became another statistic, another name on the endless list of children failed by the systems meant to protect them. But her story isn't without meaning. Andrea's case has led to changes in how missing children cases are handled in Michigan. Runaways are now investigated more thoroughly. Reports of abuse are taken more seriously. Adoptions are monitored more carefully. Andrea's death has also highlighted the power of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. Since the techniques used to identify Dennis Bowman became widely known, dozens of other cold cases have been solved using similar methods. And perhaps most importantly, Andrea's story serves as a reminder that we must ask the hard questions. We must look in the uncomfortable places. We must be willing to challenge the easy narratives that let us sleep at night. Sometimes the most horrifying truth is the one hiding in plain sight. Sometimes the runaway never ran at all. Sometimes the answer to where did they go is they never left. Andrea Bowman never left. She was there all along, waiting for someone to ask the right question. It took 30 years, but someone finally did. Thank you for watching Buried Secret Media. If this case affected you the way it affected us, please take a moment to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. These stories need to be told. These victims need to be remembered. Hit that like button to help us bring more forgotten victim stories to light. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into cases that demand justice. Andrea's voice was silenced, but her story will be told. These stories matter. These victims matter. The questions we ask matter. Stay safe and hold your loved ones close.